This is a very interesting personal topic to me, and I'll share a little story about that. I have many colleagues who I trust and adore and who have shared with me different commitments that they carry in their lives. Manzanita was opened with a very, very specific intention, which we still hold, which is probably easily summed up in the commitment to awaken a deep nature connection in young people who are in love with the earth and whose life commitments will reflect that. But what this friend of mine shared with me, and he's a mathematical cosmologist, that's what he does. His name is Brian Swim. And he's written actually some beautiful books. One of them is called The Universe is a Green Dragon. He's talking about the universe story as the story of our time. I was explaining to him, a lot of my colleagues really want to focus on this, and other colleagues want to focus on this, and I'm really committed to deep nature connection, and I don't feel like we've really fully found our way. And he said, yeah, Paul, the work we are all doing is omnicentric. And it really hit me, the word omnicentric, that there's no one path. You can't suddenly say, let's all do this one thing. Everybody has to listen to their voice and their own calling and find their voice sometimes and ask the question that Charles Eisenstein asked, which is, what is mine to do? So I did want to, though, bring to this speaker series some new things that I've encountered in my recent studies, which are very exciting to me, and I'm excited to share them with all of you. I have a lot of premises. And premises are a priori suppositions, in case you didn't know. But it's basically saying, hey, this is what I think up front, and this is something I'm going to shoot to explain or otherwise make clear to you all. And I'll start with one of them. Humans are connected to the earth, but collectively have lost an active sense of that connection. I'm just going to leave it at that. But I am going to ask you to just talk for a moment to somebody next to you, what comes to mind, or what thoughts or questions do you have when someone says that. Go ahead, anybody at all you can talk to. But I'm going to play a piano chord when it's time to bring your attention back. So go for it. To begin, we need context and we need a timeline. If anybody knows me, you know how much I love timelines. But there is this deal with timelines that it's always irked me as a teacher of kids. So this is actually from a textbook, a school textbook. This kind of thing you see in a typical school textbook. You've got all the way from 3 million years ago all the way up to the contemporary age, but there's some real problems with this. So it'll show you all these incredible things that have happened over time. First human species, first use of fire, fall of Western Rome. Okay, great. However, look at the problem here. It's really obvious when you have a sense of spatial math. So that last little window there is 500 years, 1492 to the present. That little area there is 1,000 years. So you can see right away this is not to scale. That's 3,000 years, that window, and this is 10,000 years, and here's a 3 million year window. So right away, this is going to confuse a kid, because they're going to think, well, Christopher Columbus sailed the seas to go do what he did, and then back here was the first human. So, yeah, Columbus, that was about a third of the way there or something. That's the kind of thinking you end up having. To make this thing to scale, you'd have to extend it 1,000 times longer to make it to scale with that first window. So I'll go ahead and do that for you. So if you were just to take that timeline and just stretch it out so you could actually get back to where those first humans were. So we're barely a third of the way there. And what I'm trying to share with you is that if we want to look up here and see the last 500 years, but you really want to see where humans, first discovered fire, you got to keep going back, and back. So it's no wonder it's confusing to kids and adults. I'm going to show you it's a scale timeline just to kind of give you a little context. One of the things most of us don't realize is that humans have kind of experienced a form of collective amnesia. And the example I'll give is my sister-in-law who fell off her horse and hit her head. And my brother was with her in the hospital. She had a concussion and she had memory loss. And she would sit there and then she'd say, what happened? And he'd say, oh, Kat, you fell off of Tino. And she'd say, was I wearing a helmet? And he'd say, yep. And she'd go, oh, thank goodness. Maybe 20 seconds would pass and she would say, John, what happened? He said, you fell off your horse. And she goes, was I wearing my helmet? And he said, yep. And she goes, oh, good. And she did this for 3 hours, every 20 to 30 seconds. And he had to keep leaving the room because he's like, I can't do this Groundhog Day thing. But I share that because humans essentially had this experience of losing our collective memory. And it really happened about 10,000 years ago with the discovery of agriculture for many of us here that are maybe identifying as indigenous. The discovery of agriculture led to a bunch of changes. It led to empire. However, humans lost a really long memory of a context within which we emerged. And that's why I spend time on things like this, timelines. This is the human timeline, and it's really arbitrary. That's long ago, and this is today, okay? So you can kind of picture that. I'll be real specific. That's fire making, sitting around the flickering light, and sitting around the flickering light today. And there's a reason why, I really do believe the reason screens are so appealing is they are flickering light that tell stories. And fires were flickering lights that were the context for stories. I don't think it's an accident. I don't think there's anyone here who hasn't had this experience where you're on your phone and your kids or someone's trying to talk to you, and you're pretty sure you're giving them 100% of your attention until you put your phone down and you're like, you don't even know what they just got permission to do. Was it a popsicle? I don't know. This is the great passage of time, okay? And I use fire making as a sort of starting point when humans could control friction fire because it's a long time ago, it's a nice round number, and if you think about the skill that it takes to make fire and the things that it changed in the human experience, it's a good starting point. So this great passage of time long ago and today, just how long is this? Okay, from here to here, the question is how far is that distance? Indigenous humans lived by hunting and gathering, and that's our ancestral line is indigenous. And this all happened until the agricultural revolution for those of us who descend from agricultural peoples. I think it's the majority of us in the room, probably, but to different degrees when it happened for each of us. When did this agricultural revolution happen? That's $1 million question. On the human timeline, I just usually ask people, if you got controlled use of fire here, and you have over here 2023, then this question, where would you put agriculture? And I'll just run this along here, and you just tell me to stop when you think we get to agriculture. Controlled use of fire. You guys are all really clever. Someone says there. Okay, right about there. Okay, I'll keep going.
There.
Okay, a little louder over there. Janice is like, there, right there. Paul, stop. What are you doing?
Stop.
Okay, somewhere in there. Okay. Well, farming is right there.
Wow.
It's a math problem. It's pretty easy to do the math. It's 10,000 years is farming, 1 million years is fire. Just take away the zeros. It's 1 out of 100. 1%. So 99% of the time we were nature-based, back to fire making. So I just put 100 of these little things along here, just so you could see them all. So that's 100%. Okay, so let's just say these are your ancestors positioned if you put 100 of them, it's every 10,000 years, okay? So these are your ancestors every 10,000 years lined up here, 100 of them. And they actually exist. We all have an ancestor 10,000 years ago, and 20,000, and 30,000, and 100 of them take you back to the first fire makers. So they were all making friction fire, all of these ancestors. Each one is one of your ancestors. There are 10,000 years between each one of them. And as a math problem, about 20 years is a generation. So it's 500 generations between each one of them, 500 generations. Within this line, there is going to be 50,000 generations back to the first fire makers. 50,000 generations, that's a lot of generations. There you are there, and there's the first fire maker, and that's 50,000 generations. And there's a context within which we all emerged, which Darshan Narvaez calls the developmental niche theory. It's the optimal nest theory, that we all came out of this environment of wild nature and the community of small band hunter-gatherers, and we bring with us a lot of capacities, some latent, some active, some misplaced, some exaggerated in the current times we live in. But there they are. 99% of them lived in wild nature. You are really the only exception. So if you could sit in a circle with those 100 ancestors, you'd be the only one that's not living in wild nature. And this is important. It's this 10,000 year window is when we've forgotten who we are. And it's been pretty abrupt. And we are actually remembering who we are. And I really do feel like it's a form of memory loss that's now coming back to us. We're actually remembering this, partly because we can tell this story. We couldn't have told this very story that I'm sharing like 50 years ago. We didn't have this information. And it's changing frequently, the numbers and the dates and things like that. What do these 50,000 generations have to teach us about ourselves? For one thing, and I think this is really important, and I invite you all to do this, we should not refer to ourselves as non-indigenous. There's a lot of people who go, those are indigenous people, and then all the non-indigenous people. I tend to prefer the term de-indigenized. If 99% of my ancestors back to fire makers were indigenous, it's hard for me to just go, well, I'm not indigenous, I'm an alien. So I really want to make that point. I think this is one way we can own the resonance of our beingness in relation to the wild earth. It's not like you have to have permission to be connected to the earth. You're not appropriating someone else's culture if you feel that way. It's part of who you are too. I just want to say that. It's often said that all of our ancestors and current indigenous peoples are ecocentric, meaning that they place the human at equal with all of nature. It's still found among many indigenous peoples. I'm going to talk a lot about ecocentrism today. If we understand that modern humans are de-indigenized peoples, if we can feel those 99% of our ancestors who were ecocentric in their worldview, we might easily retrieve our memories of how to relate to the land. What is modern anthropocentrism? I'm going to talk about these words because some people have a hard time saying them. Can everybody go anthropo? Anthropo. It's like part of anthropology. The word in Greek is anthropos. But anthropocentrism, and centrism is pretty common in a lot of things, but it's anthropocentrism. Try that? Anthropocentrism. Yeah, and then the alternative to that is ecocentrism. Some people call it biocentrism, but that's a whole other field that's emerging in science called biocentrism. It's not the same thing. So we're going to go with ecocentrism. How have these been represented? Okay, these are the most iconic, well-known representations symbolically of ecocentrism and anthropocentrism. Humans are centered within the context of all of nature in the ecocentric worldview. And in the anthropocentric worldview, it's a pyramid, and the humans have supremacy over nature. Those are two conceptions of how humans relate to the natural world. And post-agricultural peoples largely became very anthropocentric. It's one of the isms. So anthropocentric is the adjective describing behaviors in peoples, and then anthropocentrism and ecocentrism are the nouns that name the thing or the belief system. So you have ecocentrism, beliefs and behaviors that center the ecosystem, and anthropocentrism, beliefs and behaviors that center the human. Ecocentrism and anthropocentrism. My second premise is the Earth is alive. It is sentient and can communicate with us. The style of communication between human and Earth is different than how we humans communicate with each other. What is your reaction when you read something like that? I'm going to play a chord when we're done. Arnold Schopenhauer was a German philosopher. He was also a famous pessimist. But in 1844, he said something that I've always found very compelling. Schopenhauer said, truth moves through three phases. First, it's ridiculed. Then it's violently opposed. And finally, it's accepted as self-evident. There are many truths that have passed through Schopenhauer's three phases, and I'm just going to name a few. Living in a heliocentric universe. When that was first introduced, that the sun was the center of the universe, it was met with ridicule. Then when it got to be more popular or more compelling, it was met with violent opposition. And eventually, I think we all accept, there's a few people out there that don't, but I think we all accept that the Earth is round and it's going around the sun. Okay, slavery should be abolished. The early abolitionists were met with ridicule, then met with violent opposition, and the majority of humans today, at least in terms of how we structure our societies, it's generally accepted as self-evident that that's not okay to ever put other people in those circumstances. Women's suffrage, women should be able to vote. It was met with ridicule, violent opposition, and then general acceptance in most parts of the world. This is probably one that sounds a little funny. Mitochondria are once free-living bacteria. Every one of your human cells has 100 mitochondria inside of them, and they help metabolize energy to keep you alive. And Lynn Margulis in the 1970s said, everything about these things, they look like they might have been free-living bacteria one time, particularly this type of bacteria, and she was ridiculed. She eventually wrote all the most important books on symbiosis. She basically demonstrated that we are all highly symbiont organisms, and that every human cell has 100 essentially non-human cells. They have their own DNA. They replicate by cell division. We are outnumbered in terms of the human cells by all of not only the microbiome, but that was originally ridiculed. Then it met violent opposition. It's accepted as self-evident. The Earth is alive, a little question mark there because it's not a common thing that people say or think if they are post-agricultural. But every single one of your 99 ancestors, as far as we can extrapolate from contemporary indigenous nature-based peoples, is people that are living in the Earth, in the ecosystem, feel that everything is living. And there's more and more evidence in the sciences that are suggesting that the entire universe is a living organism of sorts. And there's a bunch of people who write about this, and it's complex, nuanced stuff, but it's certainly met with ridicule. When Miss Jennifer and I were kind of co-teaching for a little while there, and I was talking with the 8th graders, I remember one of them going, "Why do we have to be tree huggers, Dr. Paul?" And I thought, oh gosh, there's Hector, came to visit, and there's some students hugging that big oak tree out there. And then here's a student that doesn't go here anymore. I actually tried to have this conversation with them, and they were all very avidly politicized in a really beautiful way, where they were like, They were very concerned about sexism and racism and homophobia and classism. However, I was leading them on this journey of looking at ridicule as the first reaction to something that might be true. So if the tree can actually feel you, and there's an interbeing going on with the tree, and I have heard many people say that and have experiences of that kind. I have myself. We did a beautiful project called Plant Apprenticeship with high schoolers when Mr. Ira first started at Manzanita, and every student in the class had a plant to which they apprenticed themselves. Rather than us going and extracting knowledge, we wanted to make relationship and learn from the plant. Everybody had an experience of being in relationship with their plant, and it was a very beautiful thing. I have a couple videos I made about it. I share that because the ridicule to say tree hugger is really that first step. I think as we start seeing people actively defending the earth, we're seeing violent opposition to the idea that the earth has rights and beingness and sentience and should be allowed to flourish on its own intrinsic in its own intrinsic way. That idea is meeting a lot of violent opposition. I think someday it'll once again be self-evident. So James Lovelock is another person who introduced Earth system science as Gaia theory in the 1970s. James Lovelock was a British chemist who had sort of left the establishment. He did tremendous work. We showed his documentary here in this very room about a month ago. He essentially found out that the living systems of the planet regulate all the non-living systems. So the atmospheric gases were very subtly managed by the biosphere. The temperature of the planet was controlled and regulated by the living systems by the biosphere. And all of that biotic regulation, as it's called, impacted the formations of mountains, the way the seas, and it essentially, the Earth itself gave the appearance of being a biophysiology. And so he made this theory public. He wrote a book, and he was ridiculed. He was essentially kind of shunned. And he went on to write a second book called Daisy World, where he used early computer program models to demonstrate that you could create an imaginary world with black and white daisies that would self-regulate even if the sun's getting hotter. And that led people to then reconsider. Now it's an accepted field. I want to share with you a little excerpt from a video I put together a couple years ago that has James Lovelock in it. And also I'm in it, I think, too. Just take the work of James Lovelock, who founded the field of Earth system science through his Gaia theory put forward in the 1970s. This theory proposed that the Earth is self-regulating, specifically that the biosphere or the living systems regulate all the abiotic systems such as atmosphere and hydrosphere.
The initial response to the Gaia hypothesis was extremely hostile, more than negative, often dismissive, scornful.
The first serious criticism from the scientific community was an article by the biologist W. Ford Doolittle entitled, "Is Nature Really Motherly?" in which he took Gaia to the cleaners, or rather the theory.
Doolittle said, well, you'd have to imagine a committee of all of the organisms on the planet getting together every year and deciding what the level of oxygen would be in the atmosphere that year, you know.
The danger, it's not exactly distressing or disturbing except to an academic biologist who values the truth. The danger is that they will say things like, the function of oxygen is to, because it implies that individual organisms that are manufacturing that gas are doing it for the good of the biosphere.
The main thing that Richard Dawkins said was there was no way for living organisms to regulate anything beyond their bodies.
For the scientific establishment, Gaia was a mystical vision of organisms acting cooperatively to benefit Mother Earth. Fanciful nonsense.
Though this is now a reputable field of interdisciplinary study, with Auburn University, UC Irvine, University of North Dakota, Case Western, Stanford University, all graduating doctoral students each year in Earth system science, this was not the case in the beginning. So new ideas take time to become part of the common discourse and cultural practice. That some teenagers might ridicule me or Manzanita for promoting what they call tree hugging is reflective of an early reaction to the emerging biocentric worldview. Okay, premise number 3. People oriented to favor human dominance over other humans are expressing a pathology, the primary source of which may be our pronounced disconnect from wild nature. Premise number 3. Take a moment to discuss until you hear that augmented chord. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive on this. So, If you've done any academic research or scholarly research, it's a fascinating world out there, and there's all kinds of new tools to do that. One of them is Google Scholar. But there are ways that we assess human beliefs and attitudes. There's numerous psychological, sociological test instruments that have been validated over many studies, and I'm going to share a bunch of those with you, and it'll become obvious why in a little bit. Sociological and psychological research are vital elements in our quest to understand ourselves. Assessing current research should be a big part of learning. So I'm going to share some stuff with you. There are actual tests that measure people's relationship to all of these terms up here. And they're very interesting the way they're structured. I'm going to share that with you. So the first test I want to share with you is called the Social Dominance Orientation Scale. And it was developed in 1994 by a researcher named Prato and others, that's what et al. Is. And this was the original article, Social Dominance Orientation. It came out of social dominance theory, and they wanted to be able to measure people's level of social dominance orientation. It's called a Likert scale, which you have agreement and disagreement, and you pick where you land on there. And they ask a bunch of questions. Some of them are framed in the reverse. So the questions, there's 16 items on this social dominance orientation scale, so you can complete it in 3 minutes. And then what they'll do is they'll compare that to outcomes on many other studies. So the questions are really kind of provocative. Some groups of people are just more worthy than others, and you say you disagree or you agree with it. All groups should be given an equal chance in life, and there's a little asterisk because they'll get scored in reverse. In getting what your group wants, it is sometimes necessary to use force against other groups. So I'm actually going to dive into this one a little deeper, but those are the ones that get scored in reverse. So what does that look like? What is it like to take this kind of test? Well, let's see. I took it. Here we go.
This is an example of one of the scales we might use to identify people's belief systems. This is called the Social Dominance Orientation Scale, developed by researcher Prato and others in 1994. For each statement below, please indicate your level of agreement or disagreement with the statement. There is no right or wrong answer. We just want to hear your truthful perspective. Thank you for participating in this survey. I'm going to answer it as if I believe strongly in social dominance. Some groups of people are just more worthy than others. Yeah. All groups should be given an equal chance in life. I don't think so. In getting what your group wants, it is sometimes necessary to use force against other groups. Yes, that's true, unfortunately. If certain groups of people stayed in their place, we would have fewer problems. Yeah, definitely. Inferior groups should stay in their place. Yeah, I'll agree with that. And the last one on this sample quiz. We would have fewer problems if we treated different groups more equally. I don't think so. Now, you will notice that some of these items are worded in the positive, in other words, one that would indicate social dominance orientation. Some groups of people are more worthy than others, and then others are stated in the negative. All groups should be given an equal chance in life. This is a very, very common way that research studies are conducted so that individuals are able to answer the question from two different perspectives. This question, all groups should be given an equal chance in life, will be scored in reverse. So a total score would be the total numbers. This would get, instead of a 2, a score of 4. It will be scored in reverse. That will give the total for this person's particular social dominance orientation, to what extent they believe groups should have dominance over other groups in society.
I got a pretty high score. Social dominance, I'm going to share some of the research just so you can see it. Social dominance orientation is highly predictive of a multitude of antisocial attitudes and behaviors such as sexism, racism, and support for intergroup exploitation and violence. Individuals high in SDO have been shown to be less empathetic and less pro-socially inclined towards social groups, which are perceived as lower ranked, even if they are under threat and in need of assistance. This kind of a score can be obtained very quickly and easily with people that are willing to take the test, and then it can be compared with a lot of other measures. The way that they framed social dominance orientation is that it's built by these 3 axes of racism, sexism, and ageism, essentially creating in-groups around age. An increasing number of studies indicate that there is an inverse relationship between social dominance and pro-environmental attitudes associated with climate change. That's kind of not surprising. Social dominance orientation is associated with lower levels of environmentalism, with climate change denial, and also with decreased climate change threat perceptions. In simple terms, the more people value domination hierarchies in society, the less they care about the environment or believe in climate change. And this is going to become a little more important shortly because those things all relate to how we look at the world. We're going to learn about a few more of these tests which have been correlated with social dominance orientation, specific tests. Here's one called the Modern Sexism Scale, developed in 1995. The modern sexism scale is made up of 8 items, and they are these 8 items. Again, the asterisked ones are scored in reverse. I'll just read a few of them. Discrimination against women is no longer a problem in the United States. 2, women often miss out on good jobs due to sexual discrimination. That's a reverse. Number 3, it is rare to see women treated in a sexist manner on television. 4, on average, people in our society treat husbands and wives equally. These are the sorts of questions. They're very triggering for us, and because they're intended to evoke a response, but they're also intended to really evaluate the extent to which you feel that way. There are a lot of people who actually feel that over the past few years, the government and news media have been showing more concern about the treatment of women than is warranted by women's actual experiences. There's people who really feel that way. And this is on a scale that will identify those people. Just so you know, if you look this up on Google Scholar, you can see that the original article from 95 has been cited 2,332 times. What's really cool about Google Scholar is if you're really intrigued with this theory, you can click on this link right here, and then you can see the 2,300 articles that cited this article. And it's fascinating when I find a very obscure journal article and I find it cited by like 28 people. Those people are folks probably who have a similar interest to mine, especially if it's kind of obscure. So I just wanted to share that that you can learn more about these things by looking in Google Scholar. Then there's the modern racism scale. It asks 14 items. I've only listed 6 of them below. And again, they're very charged. And again, these are scaled against agree and disagree. Discrimination against ethnic minorities is no longer a problem in the United States. 2, it is a bad idea for ethnic minorities and whites to marry one another. 3, generally speaking, I favor full racial integration. Again, reversed scored. Over the past few years, ethnic minorities have gotten more economically than they deserve. And interesting, some of these are like almost talking points that you hear on certain media platforms. Again, these are the 2 reverse scored items. Again, in Google Scholar, cited 3,833 times. So you can find a lot of people who have built their own research around this particular scale. It's highly validated. The right-wing authoritarianism test, short version, it says things like, we have to crack down hard on troublemakers. Those are the kinds of things you'll see in there. This is the original article that introduced this particular short version. Basically what they did is there was a 17-item version, and they decided to see if they could get the same correlations by reducing it to 6 items. So that's some of the ways they do this research. They find out that those 6 items they chose actually work just as well. So the short version has just 6 items, and these are them. 1, it's great that many young people today are prepared to defy authority. That's a reverse score. What our country needs most is discipline, with everyone following our leaders in unity. This one's interesting because it taps the religious folks. God's laws about abortion, pornography, and marriage must be strictly followed before it's too late, etc. As you can see, it's not been around as long. Just since 2018, it's only been cited 182 times. Partly because it's a short scale, the longer scale is cited a lot more. Then there's the human supremacy belief scale. Human supremacy beliefs, animals are not aware of what is happening to them. That's kind of the center of human supremacy beliefs. Survey asked respondents 6 items. Most animals are not aware of what is happening to them. Most animals are more like computer programs. And then there's a few towards the end that are reverse scored. In an ideal world, humans and animals would be treated equally. Those are scored in reverse. Then there's the speciesism scale. I'd never even heard of this word before. Speciesism is humans can use animals however they want. There's 8 items on the speciesism scale. Humans have a right to use animals however they want. It is morally acceptable to keep animals in circuses. And then there's 1 reverse question in there. Last but not least, the anthropocentrism scale was one of the first attempts to build a scale that actually would identify the extent to which people believed in the right to dominate the natural environments. Humans have a right to modify the environment to suit their needs. Humans were meant to rule over the rest of nature. Plants and animals have as much right as humans to exist, the reverse score. It's only 3 items, and it's highly predictive of other associated scores on other tests. Fascinating research that I encountered for this presentation that I'm very excited to share with you. In June 2022, a team of researchers led by Dr. Fatih Unel, currently at the University of Geneva. He did his postdoc at Harvard. They published the results of a very significant research study on anthropocentric worldviews. It's really cool what they did. My 4th premise first. The primordial othering in the story of the human species is that which we have done to other non-human species. In other words, the original othering is that which we have done to other species. This came first. It was our separation from wild nature which has caused all other forms of domination. It's a pretty big claim. Why did Dr. Unel and his team decide to build this measure of ecological dominance orientation? First of all, it's important to define ecological dominance, and it's true other species do it too. It refers to the exertion of a major controlling influence of one or more species upon all other species by virtue of their number, size, and productivity. That's a United Nations definition. Measured by these criteria, the degree of human ecological dominance, the extent of humans' control over other species, habitats, and resources impacting ecosystems for the Earth far exceeds that of any other organism. That's true. So we are the most ecologically dominant organism. How can you measure people's relationship to that? And this is what's important and why this was such an important contribution. They said, although theoretical and empirical work on ecological dominance has progressed in many scientific disciplines, the psychology of ecological dominance has remained understudied. So it's always been seen sort of as a downstream effect that you could also say people that believe in social dominance also aren't really into climate change, they're deniers, and that those were seen as downstream. So this was really an intentional study to see if you could isolate people that had an anthropocentric versus ecocentric worldview. All of these measures here that we looked at are actually measuring psychological components of human dominance behavior. So how does human dominance show up in a psychological way? That's what they're looking at, is the psychological components of human dominance, how it shows up. This test instrument that they built, they named it the Ecological Dominance Orientation Scale. Not to be confused with the Social Dominance Orientation Scale. This is the Ecological Dominance Orientation Scale, and this again was published last June by this group of 5 scholars. So basically it was very simple what they did. They went back to this ecocentric, anthropocentric, very iconic images that have been around the literature for a while. Again, this is the human is centered within nature in an ecocentric view. It's human supreme over nature in an anthropocentric worldview. They ask this question. These are the instructions. Using the image below, what basically is ideas on how humans, animals, and the natural environment should relate to each other can differ for every person. Using the images below as a guide, indicate which arrangement you personally think represents your own preference. There's no right or wrong answers. We're simply interested in your personal preference. So they're going to move a slider. The more you move the slider to the right, the more you indicate a preference for hierarchical relationships between humans, animals, and the natural environment. The more you move the slider to the left, the more you indicate a preference for less hierarchical relationship. That's the entire study, is they ask people to move the slider where they fall. Do they fall less hierarchical or more hierarchical? That's the entire test. What they did, though, is they basically gave that test to hundreds of subjects in multiple countries. They also completed a whole set of other measures on these people about their beliefs, values, socially, politically, and environmentally. And what they found was that this test instrument was highly correlated with all these other measures. So specifically, social dominance orientation, racism, sexism, they looked at all these right-wing orientation. So what are the correlations that Dr. Fatih Unel and his colleagues discovered with their ecological dominance orientation scale? Let's look at the findings. How does racism correlate with ecological dominance orientation? Basically, when the individuals scored over to more hierarchical, this was highly predictive of increased scores on this racism test. By the same token, when they scored more towards an ecocentric worldview, it was highly correlated with reduction in the racism score. The sexism score was also given. The exact same findings. Highly correlated with increases in sexism when people are more anthropocentric and scale over to the right, and also declines in the sexism scores when they're more on an ecocentric worldview. How did it correlate with the social dominance orientation scale? Not surprisingly, the more anthropocentric, direct positive correlation with higher social dominance orientation, and the less anthropocentric, the more ecocentric, directly correlated with a reduction in social dominance orientation score. They also checked the right-wing authoritarianism scale, the speciesism scale, and the human supremacy beliefs scales. All 3 of these scales, the same findings. So the ecological dominance orientation scale, this one simple test, is correlated with increases in all of these other psychological attributes in a person. Direct positive correlation. And the inverse is also true, that declines in ecological dominance orientation, ecocentric worldviews, are all highly correlated with a reduction in all of these other inclinations in people. So in building this ecocentrism versus anthropocentrism scale, and then correlating it directly to these 6 psychological measures, Dr. Yuanal and his team have done a great deal to help us understand the psychology of ecological dominance. One of the contributions they've now made is that this social dominance orientation that was always built around the racism, sexism, and ageism axes, they have now added this anthropocentrism axes to this as well. Human connectedness, human sense of belonging. In-group mentality is born of a need for belonging. And that primordial belonging was to nature, to earth, and to unseen forces that made the earth and life possible. So I wanted to say that disconnecting from the wild earth was the first separation. And this is some research by several teams of scholars that were summed up by the same team last summer. Findings in paleoanthropology, evolutionary and organizational psychology, and ethnology suggest a coevolution between ecological dominance and more hierarchically organized forms of social arrangements. Essentially, supporting deep nature connection and stewardship of the land and human beings, as we do at Manzanita, fosters an ecocentric worldview and supports the dismantling of racist, sexist, and dominator mentalities. And I invite you to discuss with someone next to you until you hear that chord. I have another presentation I've done, and if you came to an orientation for the school, you might have seen it. But it's this model of the matrices of connection that the human goes through in nature-based cultures. The first matrix is relationship with other humans, and that goes for about 7 years, where you feel not only absolute trust, you also feel absolute belonging. And then the second matrix begins by around 7 years old, when you are old enough to go help set animal traps or collect roots and herbs or go foraging or collect firewood. And for those next few years until you reach adolescence, you're discovering this profound abundance and material resources that the earth provides, and you develop this sense of not only absolute trust in the earth, but absolute sense of belonging to the earth. And then the last one is, as you're in your teen years and you start getting all of this sort of more philosophical teachings of the tribe, you've gone through the rite of passage, you're now being introduced into the sort of the order of the adults, and you start to learn about the spirits of the mountains and the unseen forces. You develop what I would say is a sense of absolute trust in spirit, or a sense of absolute belonging to all things unseen. So I just have this little triangular diagram related to humans, then to nature, and then to spirit, as the matrix of connections that humans really crave, and that the one that gets really profoundly disrupted is this one, and it creates what I would say is a kind of relationship to the other two that is extremely inflexible. So people get very dogmatic, and they affect to other social groups because they don't actually feel like they belong to this earth. So who can they belong to? They can belong to a sort of disorienting sort of philosophical tradition that maybe is very, very intangible, or they can feel like they can affect and belong to their particular tribe of fellow skateboarders or whomever they connect with. You know, we all have those tendencies. The argument that I would make is that as you're connecting deeply to the natural world, the more than human world, especially in the ages from like 4 or 5 all the way up to 12, 14, that period of connection gives you a sense that you belong here. And it's very hard to disrupt the healthy psychological unfolding of humans when that's happening. This is the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And I wanted to show this picture because I want to sort of test this idea that when you want to make change and heal the planet, I don't think the best move is to gather up indoors. I just kind of feel like we're back to square one, which is like, we humans can fix this ourselves. Let's get together and talk about it, and we'll figure it out. I really don't think that's going to work. So I want to show you a picture of an indigenous land healing ceremony. I don't know any of the nuance of the belief systems. I just know it looks very different than getting together and having a climate conference. And maybe it looks a little more like this. I don't know. These are some 8th graders on expedition. Deep connection, deep listening. I was really struck by that James Lovelock clip that I showed you, where these really renowned scientists are saying, wow, it sounds like Lovelock's arguing that all the animals in the world are going to get together and they're going to decide how much methane the atmosphere needs, and they're going to make decisions about who's going to put more oxygen out so we get the right amount. That is so anthropocentric. It assumes intelligence is going to look like our intelligence. And I'm sorry, but the more you look at intelligence in the natural world, it doesn't look anything like our intelligence, but it is incredibly valid and very measurable. Animals and organisms and ecosystems communicate all the time, and they do it intelligently. And they do it in circumstances that never have occurred before. So the example I love to share is when these fences were set up in Botswana for cattle herding, and they set up 20,000 hectare farms where these animals graze on the Kalahari Desert. And natural things happening outside the fence, the cows can't get out, and lions generally don't have a lot of patience to hang out in there and hunt cows. They hunt out in the wild areas where all the animals are free. But every once in a while, a group of animals jumps these fences when they're being chased by a lion pride. And so a whole herd of kudu can jump over a fence, and then they have no reason to leave. So they hang out and they graze with the cows. And all of a sudden, the farmer has a fenced-in yard of wild animals and cows. And this farmer found a dead kudu. And they're these beautiful antelopes that have two very straight, curled horns that sort of spiral up. And they weigh 500-600 pounds. And he found a dead one, and it wasn't injured in any way he could tell. So he was pretty convinced that it had some kind of disease. He didn't know if it would cross over to his cattle, but he called the veterinarians at the local university, and they came out and they checked, and they said it's fine. He doesn't have any of the known pathogens that might cause any harm to your cows. So he's like, cool. And then he found another one a few days later. And then he found another one, and they were all dead, and they didn't look injured. So now they sent a veterinary team out, and they decided to autopsy these animals, try to figure out what was going on with them. The only thing they could find was that they all had impacted digestive systems, basically rotting, undigested leaves in their gut, in their stomachs. And the leaves they eat are off of the acacia trees. And they couldn't figure out what had happened to their digestive system. Something had disrupted their capacity to digest. And it had essentially suffocated them and in some cases starved them. In other cases, they were dehydrated and they died from that. But they were all dying from an acute disruption of their digestive system. So they pulled the leaves out and they examined the leaves, and the leaves had an enzyme in them that neutralized digestive gases. And what basically happened was this herd of kudu was too many kudu within this farm for the limited number of acacia trees growing there. So the acacia trees produced an enzyme to lower the kudu population. And once the population had been killed down to a sustainable number, they stopped producing the enzyme, and it was balanced again. That kind of intelligence is just remarkable. So when people talk about AI like taking over the world, it's anthropocentric. All AI has done brilliantly, essentially, is it has learned how to construct language the way we do, how to interpret meaning within language. Other than that, if that's the only kind of intelligence, then, that's an unfortunate world. It's not the only kind of intelligence. So I'm of the mind that we need to get back to an old style of relating to the land and the earth, which is to listen deeply and to ask questions of the land. I always tell people that I'm close with and that know me, when they're in a struggle to make a decision, I always say, take your shoes off and go out on the land. There's a lot of my students who do that now. They've graduated and they do that. They go out and they take their shoes off out on the land and they give their questions to the earth and they feel intuitively what needs to happen. That's how I ended up proposing to my wife. I just want to suggest, though, that the premises that I listed, which are summarized here, humans are connected to the earth is alive and can communicate with us. Social dominance orientation is a pathology born of being disconnected from nature. The first othering among humans was dominance over nature, leading to all other forms of domination. And connecting to nature builds an ecocentrism and supports dismantling of racist, sexist, and dominator mentalities. I want to suggest that this research is very, very compelling, and it really supports the argument that there are omnicentric ways to create a just world. And taking kids out on the land, letting them build compost, letting them listen quietly to the sounds of the birds, to study the tracks of animals, all these modalities that build nature connection, that is one form of the revolution that has to take place on our earth. And I do really believe the next stage is going to be the UN's going to hold their conference in the forest. And there's going to be a combination of humans coming together, humans going out to sit spots, listening, coming back, sharing what they're hearing, what they're thinking. I feel like there's a coral that grows off of the reefs of southern Australia that they've just discovered. And this coral sequesters carbon like 100 times more than most other corals. And I'd be kind of like wanting to check in with the earth, like what can we do to foster the growth of those corals? Is there something we can do to support, to just ask questions like that? I mean, there's kind of a novel way to approach the problem, novel for us de-indigenized humans, not so much for the indigenous humans amongst us. So I'm going to end there, and thank you so much for joining us.